Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Soaring Society of Boulder's ground school. This will be more of a primary ground school than some of the others that we've done. Last winter, we did a series of advanced ground schools on cross-country soaring techniques and glider maintenance and repair and other things. This ground school is going to feature two CFI-G candidates, Casey Meeks and Jeff Clayton. They are both very experienced pilots. I'll give an introduction to each of them when we get started. But really, this is for the students, and this is for folks who are working on getting their glider ratings. Some of you are primary students who haven't flown any other types of aircraft before. And some of you are transition pilots who have been flying other types of aircraft, mostly airplane. So with that, I would like a quick introduction of the students. Eric, would you unmute and tell us a little bit about where, I think you're kind of you're one of my students in the pre-solo stage. Would you just say hello and a little bit about soaring?
Hi, I'm Eric. I recently joined SSB. I'm a student here at CU Boulder, and yeah, I'm learning from Armand and going up almost every week with him. So, bunch of fun.
Richard Berryhill, would you tell us a little bit about where you stand in your glider training?
Surely. I have no prior experience flying anything other than some RC 25 years ago. So that's it. Armand, you actually got me get my student pilot certificate earlier this year.
Good.
I have begun my training at Mile High, and I have flights 10, 11, and 12 under my belt. And
terrific.
So that's kind of where I am.
Thank you, Richard.
In the process.
Great. Getting close to solo, I hope. Johan, are you with us? Can you unmute and give us a little...
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Awesome. Sorry. Yeah. So, yeah, I kind of started a little bit before the summer. I was going to start reading up on things, and then I got delayed over the summer. But I've got about 120 hours flying gliders back in Sweden about 10 years ago, and I was thinking about picking it back up again. And hopefully this could just kind of provide me with kind of the push I need, because I need to pass like the FAA exam and all that sort of stuff. I got a little bit delayed this summer, so just hoping to catch up on all the theory and get it back up into the air, hopefully.
Good. So you got some experience, but you need to get your U.S. license and rating. So
yep.
Great. Michaela, if I said that wrong, sorry. Tell us a little bit about yourself and where you stand in your glider training.
So I go to Mile High Gliding. I am about to take my solo flight, my very first one. Last week it got canceled, so I'm hoping that it doesn't get canceled for this weekend.
It's pretty weather dependent, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. Let's see, Danny Marshall, you're a club member, aren't you? And I get you're already. Tell us a little bit about your soaring. Danny, are you with us? Well, if not, then let's move on to Chen. Chen, hi.
Oh, here I am.
Oh,
sorry
Danny.
for the delay. Yeah.
Danny, go ahead.
No, I'm not a club member. I'm thinking about being one. I live in Florida. I'm a CFI-G airline pilot, kind of retired guy. Very interested in it. I've enjoyed your seminars over the winter. I thought they've been very good. And like, in fact, I was just sitting here thinking I just bought an Aerodynamics Chief. And so I'm doing some other kind of playing right now.
Great.
So, but anyway, so I'll butt out and let you guys have the show.
Good. Welcome to the ground school.
Thank you.
the next one I'm seeing here, Jack Hobbold. Go ahead, tell us a little bit about your soaring experience. Jack, go ahead.
And I would like to become a member. I'm a private pilot and I would like to get the add-on for gliders. I've been flying in Miami. I already did my solo there, but I have stopped for no reasons. So I would like to pick it up again, and I thank you so much for all the wonderful videos that you have made.
Okay, great. Well, welcome to the series. Chen, you with us?
Yeah.
Chen?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I was trained in Mile High. That was in 2014. For a while, then there's a disruption. So I went back home to Singapore for about 2 years, came back, got my license in 2018 with Mile High. And now I'm the club member over here, back in Denver for the time being. That's it.
Good. I see Jason Eli is with us. Jason is just added on his glider rating. He's doing some big flights. Been flying our discus and running up some OLC points. So Jason, welcome to the ground school. And I think you also teach in parasailing. Is that right?
Parasailing's dope on a rope. We go paragliding.
Paragliding, okay. Paragliding. Sorry, I gotta get my terminology correct.
Yeah.
Okay, did I miss anybody here? Any of the students? I think I got everybody. So let me get started here with the overview for this course. Probably the most important document to learning sailplane flying is the Glider Flying Handbook that the FAA publishes. And it's really an excellent source, and everybody who flies gliders needs to read it. It really surprises me how a bureaucracy, a big bureaucracy like the FAA, could write something that good and that informative. And the answer is they didn't write it. They went around the country to the best instructors and best pilots in the country, and they got them to write each of these sections, and then they edited it and compiled it. And I really got to take my my Gilligan hat off to the FAA for doing a great job on that. So what we're going to do in this series, we've kind of split the sections up into 3 parts. So we're going to have 3 approximately 2-hour sessions. And we're not going to teach the textbook as such, but we're using it as a guide, and you can go back and refer to it. It's got lots of great illustrations, lots of great information. And most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, it's got the FAA terminology. And when you go to take your glider check ride, there's 2 parts to it. One is what's called the oral, where the examiner just kind of talks to you about aviation and flying and gliders and what you need to know and what you need to do and what you need to know. And there's 3 answers that you can give the examiner. The first answer is you can give them the right answer. You could give them the wrong answer, or you could give them the FAA answer. And if you want to pass your check ride, you should give them the FAA answer. And the Glider Flying Handbook gives the FAA answers. I think you'll find that the FAA answer and the wrong answer are almost never the same. And I say almost. You can find something in there that isn't quite right, but generally the FAA answer is a lot closer to the right answer. And oftentimes it is exactly the right answer. So we're going to emphasize FAA terminology. And if you want your check ride to go well, when you get asked the question, use the FAA terminology answer. So we've got two glider CFI candidates here who are actually going to give the instruction for this course. Were both my students for glider add-on, and now they're my students for the CFI. And the way to really learn to be an instructor is to teach the ground school. And so that's what Casey and Jeff are going to do for you. And they've prepared presentations, and they will be involved with the 3 different sessions. And we're going to have them take turns with different topics to keep it a little more interesting and let them go. So let me introduce Jeff and Casey. Jeff Clayton was a military career pilot, flew F-16 and evidently flew quite a bit. When he got out of the military, he got a CFI in CFII, I guess, in helicopter. I haven't flown helicopter with him, but I suspect he's pretty good. He's been flying some great cross country. I mean, for his first year of flying Soaring sailplane, he's been flying some really big LLC points. He's done great. He was really pounding on me last winter about, I really need to go flying. I'm like, well, you got to wait for the season. And boy, when the season came around, he really took advantage of it, and it's just been doing great. He's one of the shining stars at SSB. Casey Meeks is a career aviator also. He flies for an airline and flies Airbus he also owns, I think, 3 different airplanes and a glider. After he got trained, he wanted to buy his own glider. He goes out and buys his own glider, and Casey's been doing a lot of para sailing. Did I say that right? And he's done some big parasail flights. He's also been out over the 14ers with his new glider and all that. So that's Jeff and Casey's background and the short version. And you know what, gentlemen, I forgot how we had the sections. So who's going to go first?
I think I'll kick it off, Armand.
Okay, go ahead, Casey. It's all yours.
Excellent. Could you enable screen sharing, and I'll throw my presentation up there. Thanks for the intro, Armand, and to everyone on. Thank you very much for your time tonight. Again, as Armand said, we're going to step through the Glider Flying Handbook. What I did when I went back through the chapters that I'll be presenting tonight was really kind of looked at it from an examiner's eyes. One of my roles at the airline that I work for is what's called an aircrew program designee, to issue type ratings to new pilots on the Airbus. And so going back through it and kind of understanding what the examiner would want to hear is kind of how I formatted my presentation. So please go back later and read those sections yourself as well. That's very important. Let me bring up the presentation. All right. Armand, can you see that okay?
Yes, it looks great. Yeah, gliders, chapter 1, gliders and sailplane.
Great. All right. Well, I wanted to start my presentation off with a quick video. So as you get into your training, you're going to spend a lot of time going through these books. Some of it can get a little bit mundane. A lot of the flights that you do are just pattern tows. Armand's going to drill you, or whoever your instructor is, with lots of questions. And it's important to keep perspective on what this means and what we're all shooting for. So just a really quick video to kick us off here.
Ooh.
Great. I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope that you get to be in that place soon. I actually started flying just a little over a year ago, obviously a professional pilot with an ATP, and came in and did my glider rating add-on. One of the interesting things about doing an add-on, for those of you who already hold a rating, is it's attached to, I guess, really your last certificate that's not your ATP. So in my case, that was a commercial rating. And I think Jeff was the same. So we actually both trained for commercial glider ratings, which was similar to when I got my seaplane rating. It was a commercial seaplane rating as well. As you prepare for this next journey, there's some really great resources I'd like to point out. Obviously, one we've talked about is the Glider Flying Handbook. And then a companion book to that that's really good is the Pilot Handbook. Those are both FAA downloads, really great PDFs. And a lot of what is covered in the Glider Flying Handbook is really kind of just a small subset of what you could be tested on and you're expected to know in the Pilot Handbook as well, especially if it's a first rating. Something else you want to download is the PTS, the Practical Test Standards for your appropriate rating if you're doing a private rating or if you're doing a commercial rating add-on. Interestingly, those are PTSs still, not ACSs. Most other ratings and certificates are in the ACS now, but that's still a relatively old document, but still valid today. One of really great sources for learning too, again, is our own website, soarboulder.org. And we have an associated YouTube channel as well. I think most of you have seen, and this series will be put up on. A lot of the previous videos, though, are very advanced techniques, advanced racing techniques, soaring techniques, and maintenance techniques. So really great library of videos that Armand's helped put together and make available for free. The national organization, SSA.org, is a good resource. And one of our own members, Clemens, runs a website called Chess in the Air. And if you haven't looked at Chess in the Air, I really recommend you take a look at that. Just absolutely inspiring. Clemens really started documenting his early career as a glider pilot and regularly films his cross-country flights and then goes through a deep dive analytical review of those flights. And I think it's safe to say all of us have learned a lot from watching those videos. Getting into the winter season, Condor Soaring, if you have a smoking hot computer, is a great fun thing too. And actually you can learn a lot about soaring from that. Really great soaring simulator that if you need some help setting up, a lot of the club members use that too. So please take a look at those resources, and I think that'll help keep you motivated in this next phase of your training. Anytime we start moving forward, it's important to look back where we started. The dream of soaring flight, I think, has always been with man, but the visionary Leonardo da Vinci obviously started drawing about this in the early 15th century. Later, Sir George Cayley conceived of a craft with stationary wings, which at the time really was revolutionary. Everybody before that had conceived of a flying craft that you had to flap like a bird. But Sir George Cayley recognized that soaring flight was actually something that could be accomplished with a fixed wing aircraft, which we fly today. Otto Lilienthal was the German pioneer in the early 1800s who made the first really successful gliding flights, very well documented, and just hundreds and hundreds of flights off a small hill, perfecting his designs. And then, of course, the Wright brothers in the 1900s, their early aircraft wall gliders, which they added power to and kind of led into the modern aviation today. I think those are some key people that we want to remember as we move forward. Throughout this series, you're going to hear an interchangeable term, glider or sailplane. Those really are interchangeable. What you'll receive is a glider rating. But the FAA really defines this as, a glider. A glider is a heavier than air aircraft that's supported in flight by the dynamic reactions of air against its lifting surfaces, and whose flight does not depend principally on an engine. If you've been out to Boulder, you may have seen some what we call self-launch sailplanes, and some of us have sailplanes with sustainer engines, but those are just used in place of a tow plane, and technically they're still gliders. The strict term sailplane is really an efficient aircraft that's designed to fly and gain altitude solely from natural forces such as thermal and ridge waves. So you'll hear those terms interchangeably. As you go through looking at the schools, the FAA actually offers two different training paths. A Part 141 training school is typically reserved for like professional pilot training. It provides a bit more structured training with a standardized FAA approved training syllabus. All of the training done in Boulder, though, is done under Part 61, which gives a little more latitude to the components of those training. You're not required to complete a formal ground school. Instead, you could do something like this, attend a course, do a home study course, or of course your CFI can sign you off for the ground portion. And Armand, I actually looked for a 141 based glider school and couldn't find anyone in the country. Do you know of a 141 glider school?
Negative.
No. Yeah.
I don't think it exists. It's
heavy, pretty specialized.
Yeah.
Cool. Some of the basic requirements, obviously, to be able to fly solo, you need to be 14 years of age and have the aeronautical knowledge on a test developed by your instructor. For a private, 16 years of age, complete the training and the flight time requirements described under FAR Part 61. FAR Part 61 is a very important part for you to look up in your training here to understand the requirements for your specific type of rating that you're seeking. And then, of course, you still have to pass the knowledge test and a practical test, as Armand said. And then if you're doing a commercial add-on or a glider, instructor glider, then 18 years of age, and again, course, the knowledge test, and another practical test in that case. This section's a little bit short, but there are a couple of common terms that will be thrown around that are important to wrap your head around, especially if you're transitioning from powered aircraft. One is to remember, obviously we still use knots as we do in standard aviation. A nautical mile is 6,076.115 feet. We're going to round that to 6,000 feet. If we divide that by 60 minutes, that equals 100 feet per minute. And actually, you're going to see that a lot on the variometers that we use to indicate climbs in the aircraft. If we see 1 knot, that's approximately 100 feet a minute. So a really easy conversion there. And then, of course, most of what we fly when we fly tasks or set up our own tasks or evaluate our flights are done in kilometers and meters. So lots of switching to metric systems in that case. That's just a very quick introduction, and I look forward to talking to you more. I'll do 2 more sections later. Before we move on to Jeff, any questions on anything brought up so far? All right, I'll stop sharing and hand it over to Jeff.
Jeff, go ahead with your.
All right, you got me enabled?
It should be. Give it a try. If there's a problem, I'll see what I can do.
All right. All right. Well, first thing, Casey, thanks for that excellent introduction to Soaring. And I want to add that one of the reasons that I'm going for my CFI-G is it does force you, if you want to put it that way, to get back into the books and not get complacent. So I look forward to the opportunity to help teach these ground school lessons, and like I said, it'll get me back in the books. And just like Casey, my eye was to what's the FAA going to want to see, and what Armand also talked about. So we'll keep that in mind. If you have any, we have a pretty small audience, so if you have any questions or comments, especially something that's really burning you or doesn't make sense, please don't hesitate to interrupt. So we're going to talk first about components and systems in the aircraft. So that has to do with the design of gliders, the components that make up a glider, and then briefly we'll touch on power plant systems. So Casey talked again in the introduction about some of these. So moving on. Glider design, gliders have been around since the advent of aviation. So the materials they started out.
Jeff, are you showing a slide? Are you sharing a slideshow?
Yeah, you're not seeing it?
Correct, not seeing it.
Okay. Are you seeing it now?
No, sir.
Okay. Let's go back to
The green button on the bottom ought to be able to give you the screen sharing.
yeah, okay. I see the problem here is
Okay, I think, there we go, working now, good.
so you see glider design?
Yes,
Okay, good.
please proceed.
Sorry about that. I had it beautiful on my screen, but it wasn't going to you guys. Anyway, so, gliders have been around since the advent of aviation. So materials they're made of have progressed much in line with the rest of aviation. Starting out, we had wood and fabric type of aircraft, like you see there, and the one in the red. Low performance, but generally easy to fly and pretty safe, pretty benign, low speed. Progressed on to a steel and fabric type of composition. These, became popular. The Schweitzer 126 in 1954 kind of really touched off the use of these materials in gliders, and then progressed on to metal wings with steel tubing and fabric fuselages, to where we had all aluminum type of aircraft. And again, the 126 was one of those. As composites became more available and easier to work with, they became the mainstay of glider construction, or at least as it advanced. Another thing that helped this was computer-aided design as this went on, and this really touched off the transition from what you might call a glider to a sailplane. Some of the special features that we find in gliders, modern gliders, we have laminar flow airfoils, and for that matter, the entire glider design will have a laminar shape to it, and that's why you see that kind of shape to the fuselage as well. Another special feature of gliders is ballast. It's something that we'll talk about more when we go into the aerodynamics of flight, but ballast is a key part of especially competition or long distance gliding. Winglets, another aerodynamic enhancement that makes the wings much more efficient. Gap seals, what we're referring to is layers of mylar and tape so that we don't have any possibilities of air coming through the aileron sections or around the rudder or other places where we have joining parts. On to certification, gliders can be either certified as a standard utility type of aircraft or limited type of aircraft by the FAA, or they can be experimental, and you'll find good examples of both types. The EASA is the European version. A lot of gliders are built in Europe, I'd say the majority. And so usually they'll have that certification, which is, I think, more stringent than the FAA. So it's a good thing. FAI, I don't remember what that specifically stands for, but they're basically the governing body of sport aviation. Categorizes gliders into 7 competition categories, but it's also useful to kind of gauge on what type of a glider you're going to be flying based on that. And it has to do with wingspan, whether there's flaps on the glider, whether there's the number of seats. So, 1 or 2 seats, or actually some gliders have 3 seats, and age or vintage, and some of the inherent capabilities of the glider. Okay, moving on. Talk about the basic airframe components of a glider. We have the fuselage, of course, which is the main area where the cockpit is and the wheels are mounted. And then we have the wings, which are attached to that. And we have the empennage, also known as the tail. And on the wings, we have ailerons, and that's what we use for roll control. We have air brakes, which are not unique to gliders, but are pretty much every glider is going to have them, which is the way where we can control our glide path, a very important part of the aircraft. We have the horizontal tail, and attached to that the elevator, which is going to control our pitch. We have vertical tail or stabilizer, and a rudder, which is going to control our yaw or lateral control. All gliders are going to have at least 2 wheels, and that's going to be your main wheel and your tail wheel. They may also have tip wheels or skids. And some gliders, particularly training gliders, are going to have a nose wheel in this area. Another feature that's unique to gliders is you're going to have a tow hook capability. You can either have a nose release, which is going to be right on the nose or just aft of that, and the CG or center of gravity release. And those are very important because they have to deal with how you're getting towed up into the air, which one you're going to be hooking into. Sometimes the main wheel can retract, even on very advanced gliders, the tail wheel can retract because we're looking to have as aerodynamically efficient as possible. The wings will typically, especially on anything above a small training type of glider, going to have locations where they separate. So each wing will come off the glider, and then the wing may separate into 2 or even 3 pieces, and the winglets as well could come off. And there's connections on that to make them connect together so that you don't have intricate moving parts in there. It just, they snap together, and usually there's a central locking pin on the wings to make sure that the spars are held together. Another component that's not shown on here is flaps, and flaps are used to change the camber of the wing. On gliders, flaps will have multiple settings. The more down they are, the more lift they provide, and then at some point they also provide a fair amount of drag. So the lift part of that would be for when you're thermaling, the flaps will be in a more streamlined position to the wing for cruising, and then even can go to a negative position or a negative camber to make you fly even more efficiently through the air at high speed. Okay. Next, so we talked about the fuselage. Here's a diagram or a picture of the wings and how they would separate. So you can see the vertical fin is off of this wing, and there's the spar of the outer portion of that wing. And you can also see how the spar integrates into the wing in that position there. Here's a picture of the spoilers that I talked about popping out, and they can vary from flush with the wing to full up, and they can create quite a bit of drag. And the flaps in the neutral position there for cruising, flaps down for soaring or for landing, or I should say for thermaling or for landing, and flaps negative if you're in cruise flight. A little picture here of what your ailerons are doing for you, and as the aileron goes down on one side, that pitches that wing up, and as it goes up on the other side, it pitches it down. And here's a picture of just how there's also dive brakes, which are used on some aircraft, which extend down from the wings, as well as a spoiler extends up, and a dive brake goes from both positions. And the flaps as they would appear in the down position there. All right, for our empennage or tail, as I mentioned, we got a vertical and horizontal stabilizer. Those are fixed surfaces. The rudder is what's going to control your yaw or left and right movement of the nose. Your elevator on the tail is controlling your up and down control movement, and that's called pitch. For our empennage variations, so you've probably seen on powered aircraft that you have various configurations of the tail. You can actually have where you have no horizontal tail, and I'll show you a picture of that shortly. It's basically like a flying wing. A T-tail, which as the name says is the tail is in a T formation. A V-tail, which is shaped that way as well. A stabilator, which is basically where the whole horizontal tail moves to give you your pitch control, as opposed to having an elevator. And then I'll show you what trim tabs, which basically reduce the forces on the stick. So as you move the stick forward and after your pitch control, it enables less force on your stick. So here's a little picture of those things there, and the trim tabs again are on these surfaces. I have yet to see trim tabs on a glider. I think the forces are typically not so high. Maybe Armand, you have experience with trim tabs on gliders?
No, trim tabs seem to be unique to airplane. Glider, I haven't seen. Usually we just have a frictional something that holds.
Right, on the stick itself. Okay, so here's the empennage variations. As you can see on this example here, it's basically just got a vertical tail, and the wing is actually providing the pitch control. I got to see, as did Armand, one of these flying at a contest we were at in Utah, and it seemed to perform quite well. Did quite well. A V-tail pictured here. So what's kind of unique about that is that they're let's see, they would be called elevons. Is that the name for those? That they control both the yaw and the pitch of the aircraft through a mixture control on that. A T-tail is simply where, like I said, the tail, the horizontal tail is on top. And then a stabilator, the entire surface here is going to move for your pitch control. Okay, power plant systems. We have two basic kinds of power plant systems. We have the self-launch, and we have the sustainer. Your self-launch, again, there's two basic varieties. There's the touring, which is a picture of one here. It's made more for acting like a normal powered aircraft. Usually the performance of it's not going to be quite as good as other gliders, but there are some examples where there's very good performance. In fact, the one that's shown here, a STEMI, I think holds the world record distance record in gliders. So it does not confer necessarily a performance disadvantage. But in aviation, you have three things. You can have any two of those things. You can spend a lot of money, you can have high performance, or you can have low cost, but you can't have high performance and high performance, or low cost and high performance aircraft at the same time. Sustainer engine, you either have a front end sustainer, which is pictured here, and it's basically propeller blades that fold back against the fuselage, and is basically used for if you are in low lift situation, but not trying to climb that much, and it'll just help you get to an area where you might find a little more lift. And then we have the pop-up aft. That can be both a sustainer or a self-launch in this case. So some of the higher performance ones actually are capable of taking off, and we have some examples of those at Boulder. One thing about engines in gliders is one should never think of them, except in the case of perhaps of a touring glider, but even there, as a 100% reliable power source. So when pilots fly with gliders with engines in it, they always need to be thinking of themselves as a glider first, and they have a power system. So not relying on that to get out of a tight situation, but rather using it to either launch up into start soaring, or like I said earlier, ability to get to maybe an area of better lift. Okay. Any questions on components, systems of gliders?
I think that was all pretty good. Oh, somebody have a question? Jeff, I think that was great. I'd say just keep moving.
Okay. Let's see. Let's stop this share and we'll get our other. There we go. All right, moving on, we're going to talk about flight instruments in the aircraft, and these have to do with determining our direction, altitude, speed, and performance of the aircraft. Important in gliding, even though gliding more so than powered flying is more of a visceral form of flying, more of a seat of the pants. It's kind of actually essential to becoming a good glider pilot, a good soaring pilot. Hang glider and paraglider pilots often fly without instruments. I was a hang glider pilot, and for a long time, I was able to soar without instruments. But there's no doubt that the flight instruments will make you a much more capable and safe pilot. I'm going to focus mainly on the pedostatic instruments because those have the most to do with that safe and effective soaring. So there are categories of flight instruments. Pedostatic flight instruments include the altimeter, airspeed indicator, and variometer.
Excuse me, Jeff.
Yeah.
Could I just, are you presenting like a presentation? We don't see the presentation on the Zoom.
we go.
Perfect. Thanks.
Thank you. So our flight instrument categories: pitot-static, which include the altimeter, airspeed indicator, variometer, electrical/electronic, which include flight computer, FLARM, also variometer and other displays in the aircraft. Magnetic, which is our compass. Gyroscopic, which you rarely will see in gliders, again, more predominantly in the touring type of a glider. And gyroscopic include heading indicator, turn and slip, attitude indicator. And then what they call self-contained, which are the yaw string, outside air temperature, and G meter. Your displays often include some of the between the pitot-static and the electrical electronic are combined in modern type of flight instruments. So on a pitot-static, pitot refers to impact pressure, and it's a forward-facing tube in the nose or the vertical tube or tail. And static pressure is referring to ambient or atmospheric pressure, and those will be side-facing holes in an undisturbed air part of the aircraft. So you can see here the pitot tube is either going to be on the nose typically or in the vertical tail, and we have examples of both of those at Boulder. And your static port will be in an area of the fuselage where there's not going to be any kind of impact air or Venturi type of effect. So it's going to basically just be as though it's in still, as much as possible in still air. And you can do the same thing on the side. So really it's all about physics. Changes in pressure cause changes in forces, which are measured and calibrated to show airspeed and altitude. The airspeed indicator uses both a pitot and static pressure. The pitot air pressure moves a diaphragm after a series of tubes in the instrument, which has static pressure on the other side. So you have the tube coming from the static port and a tube coming from the pitot tube, and between them you're going to have a diaphragm. And basically, based on physics, the greater the difference in pressure, the more the diaphragm moves, which corresponds to a higher speed. And it's important to understand that the air actually isn't moving through the pitot tube and out any place. It's all about comparative pressures. Altimeter uses only static pressure. In this case, the static pressure moves a diaphragm that has was essentially a vacuum on the other side. And an increase in altitude causes that static pressure to decrease because static pressure decreases with an increase in altitude. And that moves that diaphragm because the forces decreased on the static pressure side, and it corresponds to an altitude increase. Just as a side note, you know, on the air pressure, at 18,000 feet, we have roughly half the air pressure that we have at sea level. And the altimeter that's used in the glider is a sensitive altimeter, which has really tight calibration, enabling you to see differences of 10 feet or less in altitude. So just a picture of how that operates. So if this is just kind of a schematic, if we have impact pressure here coming in at 1,013 millibars, and on the other side, the static pressure is 1,013 millibars, it's going to show an airspeed of 0 because we're not getting any change differences in pressure. If we're moving along at 60 knots and the air pressure is 1019, that's an increase in pressure that's going to move that diaphragm and move that needle over. On the altimeter side, we have these aneroid wafers, which are the static pressure as it decreases allows these wafers to expand, which goes through a mechanism and changes the indication on the dial. All right, little question answer here. Anybody have, who's not a current pilot, an idea of the different types of airspeed that we might measure? Or different types of airspeed that would be concerned with, I guess is another way to put it.
I guess I'll start off with the IAS, so the indicated airspeed.
Right.
And then someone wants to chip in. True airspeed, I guess.
Uh-huh.
And your ground speed, of course, because relative to the ground, and then your calibrated airspeed.
Right. So when we're flying a glider, as you said, indicated airspeed, that's what the instrument's going to display. It's basically uncorrected for any atmospheric changes. So if you have differences in humidity and temperature and such, it's not going to account for that. Installation, which really isn't about errors in the installation, but it's more about the fact of you're not going to have perfectly undisturbed air, or especially at different flight regimes, you're going to have different pressures that you would have that would change the indication from being an actual true indication. And then instrument errors, you know, in the design of any instrument, there's going to be some irregularities or calibration problems. Calibrated airspeed is, you know, corrections for the instrument and installation type of error. So that's going to be most evident at low speeds or high side slip angles. So you're going to have display errors that come from that the calibrated airspeed will actually correct for. And then true airspeed is your actual airspeed through the air, and that is calibrated airspeed corrected for air density. And air density is a function of both altitude and temperature. The air is more dense at low altitude and cold temperatures, and less dense at higher altitude and warmer temperatures.
So Jeff, could you give us, jump back to that previous, can you give us when indicated and true might be the same airspeed, and what factors would make them different, and in which direction would they be different?
Yeah, so you can see, I mean, on this picture here, we've got a needle pointing at this inner ring, and this inner ring's got different airspeeds. And then we have this little thing here in which we can adjust with this setting here. So it's got temperature of the air, and then this right here is going to be what your altimeter is showing. And so as you rotate this, it also rotates this dial here. And the point of that is that as the temperature increases or decreases, that's going to change your true airspeed based on what your indicated is, or I guess more accurately, it's going to change your indicated based on what your true is. So let me ask this. So we're just, you know, we're a few hundred feet above the ground at sea level, and we're going along at 60 knots. How much different would our true airspeed and our indicated airspeed be? Right. So as the closer you are to the sea level, the more similar that they're going to be. You're going to have very little differences in that. As the temperature is warmer, it's going to change your true airspeed. So if we jump up to 17,000 feet and we're showing 60 knots, would our true airspeed be faster or slower than? So your true airspeed is going to be higher than your indicated airspeed at higher altitudes. And the higher you go, the more that difference is going to be, which is important for a few different reasons. But from a soaring perspective, it means that you're covering more ground than you would be at a lower altitude. So you're going to be flying at a given indicated airspeed. At higher altitudes, you're going to be going faster, so you're going to cover more ground more quickly. Right. So we need to be concerned when we're flying our glider and we're showing some speed and we're up high at high altitudes.
we're actually going quite a bit faster through the air than what our airspeed indicator is telling us. Whereas if we were down at sea level, it's probably going to be pretty close to the same.
Right. It's not something that you could use in flight necessarily, but an approximation is for every 1,000 feet you go up, your true airspeed increases by about 2% more over your indicated airspeed. So at 18,000 feet, it's going to be 36% higher.
Great. So that's an FAA answer.
So,
Cool.
so Jeff, may I ask a question?
Sure.
I may jumping ahead. I mean, you may be answering this later on, but there's a published airspeed for a glider, which is V&E, velocity never exceed. So at sea level, that V&E, let's say for a particular glider, it would be 150 knots. Okay. At 18,000 feet, is that 150 knots the 150 knots true airspeed, or is it 150 knots indicated airspeed?
Well, that's a good question, because I'll say that it depends. Typically, it's going to be indicated airspeed. So the red line you see on there is what it is. But gliders are, I won't say unique, but they're pretty much across the board have another issue. And it's not just a limiting speed for parts would just, wings would just rip off the aircraft, so much as a phenomenon known as flutter. And with flutter, it's more of relative to true airspeed. Most of the speed things that we need to concern ourselves with flight are more to do with our indicated airspeed, our stall speeds, our best glide speeds, our rough air speeds. But when it comes to your velocity never exceed above a certain level, and it'll be published in the glider flight manual, your indicated speed comes down. And that is, again, because of a phenomenon known as flutter, which is to do with the controlled surfaces. The physics behind it, I couldn't explain for you. I've never seen a layman's explanation of it. But to your point, at 17,000 feet, it's likely that your VNE, velocity never exceed, is going to be less than what you see on that red line there on your airspeed indicator. Does that answer your question?
Richard, does that answer your question? You might be muted.
Yeah,
So,
I had muted myself. I think so. So looking at the airspeed indicator that you're showing on the diagram, are you saying that at 18,000 feet, that red line would actually that would not actually be it? It would be less than that.
That is what I'm saying, but I
Okay.
can't give you a definitive altitude because it's going to depend on each glider.
Yeah, no, I understand. I
yeah.
get that. Yeah. Okay.
All right.
Jeff, as long as we're on this subject, and the indicated versus true airspeed is something that often comes up in the check rides. So what about as we go up? We know that our true altitude is going to be, as we go up in altitude, our true airspeed is going to be higher than our indicated. But what is stall speed, best glide, min sync? Those are all based on what kind of airspeed, indicated or true?
Are you asking your audience or me?
I'm asking you to Yeah, I'm
Okay.
asking you to kind of talk about it. So
Yeah.
I guess what I'm driving at is, your stall speed, your best
Yeah.
glide, your min sink, all those speeds, they're all based on indicated airspeed.
Right. And we'll cover that in a moment.
Oh, okay. I'll let you. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah.
Jumping too soon.
So as part of that, we have airspeed markings on the airspeed indicator, and we'll talk about those. We'll start with the white arc here. This is your flaps speeds. So the minimum there, right there, is your stall speed, indicated airspeed, stall speed with your flaps out. Your top end of the white arc there is your indicated speeds, maximum speed for having your flaps out. So it's a stall speed and it's a maximum speed for flaps. Your green arc, the lower limit, is your stall speed with your flaps up. So with no flaps out. And your upper limit there is what we call normal operating speed. So you could be basically operating in any kind of air at that speed. There will be a caveat, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And then your yellow arc is your caution range. And this is a range where you want to avoid unless you're in smooth air. So if you're gliding through smooth air, you're okay to be in that. And then as we just talked about, your red line is your velocity never to exceed. At low altitudes, and I feel safe to say any glider below about 12, 13,000 feet, that's going to be your actual velocity never exceed. It gets tricky when you get higher in altitudes, and we commonly do over the mountains. So these are all indicated speeds that we're talking about there. And again, flaps out, maximum, minimum, flaps up, that's your stall speed, all the way up through your normal operating speed, your caution range, and your velocity never to exceed. But we have airspeeds that are not marked on the indicator. And one of those is maneuvering speed, also known as VA. So maneuvering speed is defined by the FAA as the maximum speed at which a limit load can be imposed either by gusts or full deflection of the control surfaces for one cycle without causing structural damage. Well, that kind of is not a very easy to understand way to explain it. What I would call maneuvering speed is if you're in rough air and you stay at or below that speed, the glider will not brake because it will stall before that happens. So aerodynamically, it will relieve that load on the wings before it has a chance to stall. The other side of that explanation by the FAA, full deflection and control surface, means that if you're below that speed and you go full aileron or full rudder or full back stick, full elevator up or down, that you won't brake the airplane again because it will relieve that pressure through a stall, or just will not have the forces to damage the aircraft. We'll get back to maneuvering speed. There's a little more to it, as I suggested. We also have landing gear operating speed that's not indicated on the airspeed indicator. So for your retractable gear, VLO is landing gear out, VLE is extending. So I don't know of any glider where those are different, but there's a speed where you don't want to operate the landing gear or have it out above that speed. Min sink speed, very important speed in gliders, but it's not indicated on the airspeed indicator. That's the speed at which the glider is going to descend the slowest through the air. So it's the least rate of descent through the air. Best glide speed, also very important in a glider. This really can't be indicated on there. It could be in still air, but depending upon whether you have a headwind, a tailwind, whether you're in lift or sink, your speed's actually going to change. But in undisturbed air, your best glide speed is going to be somewhere above your min sink speed. So it's going to be a matter of a few knots above that, and your min sink speed is going to be a matter of a couple few knots above your stall speed. So we need to be proficient at flying our aircraft at speeds that are just above stall for that reason. You're also not going to have on the airspeed indicator max aerotow or ground launch, winch launch type of speeds. So that's just going to be, again, a number that you need to know. Back to maneuvering speed. This actually changes also. Another reason it can't be on the indicator based on the weight of the aircraft. The heavier the aircraft is, so the occupant plus if you have any ballast on board, the higher your maneuvering speed is. And I won't get into the physics of that, but it is a fact that you need to know. And there's actually a formula to figure out how much your maneuvering speed is reduced based on a lower weight. And that is the maneuvering speed at full gross weight times the square root of your actual weight of your aircraft, fully loaded, divided by your max gross weight. So it's going to be a square root function of the ratio of those weights, and it's going to always be less if you're below that gross weight. Gliders often, or glider flight manuals often have a rough speed, airspeed that they placard also, and can be the same as maneuvering speed, or it might be another speed that's slightly lower than that. Another thing about min sync to understand that you'll need to know for purposes of the FAA for your check ride and just to be a safe glider pilot is that min sync speed will actually change based on your bank angle. So if you're straight and level flight, your min sync speed is going to be, like I said, a couple of knots above straight and level flight stall speed. But as you bank the aircraft up, as you're going to do in a thermal, that speed actually will change and will go up. So because your stall speed goes up, your min sync speed also will go up. And there's also ratios that apply there. But suffice it to say, most of the time, you're not going to thermal at more than a 45-degree bank, because your speed that you'll need to fly that min sync will be so high that you're going to have a pretty good sync rate going. So you're trading off a tight turn in a thermal for an increased sync rate. This is kind of just a graphical depiction. This is not a glider if you look at the airspeeds here, but this is G limits, or G forces, I should say, on the vertical axis and airspeed on the horizontal axis. And what it's showing here is this would be your stall speed based on just the characteristics of the airfoil. And it depicts also your maximum normal operating speed, and then that caution speed, and this would be your red line or your VNE. And then you have a maximum Gs that are allowed in the aircraft. And you can see where this maneuvering speed is on the diagram here. So it's where the stall speed, which goes up as your Gs are increased on the aircraft, and your maximum load factor allowable on the aircraft, your max G load that you can put on the aircraft. And where those two meet is going to be your maneuvering speed. And as I was saying, that you will not be able to exceed your structural limit long as you're at or below that speed. If you get up above that, you can see that if your point were right here, you'd be at that in that structural damage area. And so that's kind of what this diagram here is showing, as well as you increase Gs, which will happen if you increase the bank, that your stall speed goes up. So we were talking earlier about, why do airspeed different, why the types of airspeed that we're talking about, why does that matter? So indicated airspeed is mostly what you're going to use to fly. And that mostly really comes into play when we were talking about that V&E. For most of the flight you're going to do, 99% of the time, 100% of the time, if you're not flying at high altitude, is what you're going to fly off of. So your stall speed is going to always be based on indicated speed, no matter your altitude, no matter your conditions. Your maneuvering speed, your flap extension speeds, your gear speeds are all based on indicated airspeed. So that's important because we don't have to do any kind of calculations to figure out what speed do I need to see on my airspeed indicator. These stay the same no matter the altitude or atmospheric conditions. Your calibrated airspeeds are usually going to be close to your indicated airspeeds, except in the slide, slip, or slow. Most of the time in your glider flight manual, airspeeds are going to be referenced, are going to be indicated, but it is possible that they're going to reference calibrated airspeed. And in any case, for the various airspeeds, they should have a table that shows you the correction factor to get your calibrated airspeed versus your indicated airspeed at those other flight regimes. True airspeed is, I say, useful to know how the glider is actually performing, because that is what you're going to be doing across the ground. If you're at 18,000 feet, you're going to be flying a lot faster across the ground than what your indicated airspeed says. Well, wind's dependent, of course. But it's also important, as we talked about earlier, to determine your never exceed speed. So to understand that it's actually true airspeed that's going to be at higher altitudes dictating what your V&E speed is. That said, you're still going to be looking at a indicated airspeed. You're just going to have to know that it's going to be lower at higher altitudes and know what your glider flight manual has for that. As we talked about earlier, true airspeed increases with altitude relative calibrated airspeed, and V&E is a structural limit, usually based on flutter, and it is going to decrease as your altitude goes up. Okay, types of altitude. As a glider pilot, there's going to be 5 different types of altitudes that we're concerned with. Pressure altitude is an indication if you set in standard sea level pressure, which is 29.92 inches of mercury, set into your altimeter. This is really only used above 18,000 feet in the US, and that's what we call a transition altitude. But the other important thing about pressure altitude is you can get an idea of what the instability of the atmosphere is, and also it's necessary for calculating your density altitude, which is going to give you an idea of what your performance is going to be at higher altitudes. Density altitude is pressure altitude that is corrected for a non-standard temperature and accounts for the temperature effects, and to a lesser degree humidity effects on performance. Much more important for a powered aircraft or for your tow plane, high density altitudes at Boulder will often in the summertime are over 8,000 feet of density altitude, and that affects the climb rate of the tow plane. So you might not be climbing out very well, and that's because the density altitude is high. So it is important for us anytime we're under tow or if we're in a self-launched sailplane. Or the other area where it could be important is if you were landing, say, at Leadville, where your density altitude might be well above 10,000 feet, you're going to have a longer rollout because that true airspeed is going to be higher. True altitude is basically your altitude above mean sea level. These 3-letter identifiers are just, if you hear QNE, QNH, that's referring to pressure altitude or true altitude. Indicated, simply what the instrument displays. This will be the same as true altitude if you have the correct altimeter setting in your altimeter. And absolute altitude is basically your altitude above the surface, above ground level. If you had a radar altimeter, it would be that, but rarely something that we think about in the US, though if you were flying over flatlands where there's not going to be a lot of change in altitude, you might use what they call QFE altimeter, which is basically to set your altimeter so it's showing 0 at the surface. Useful so you always know how high you are above the ground, but in any kind of undulating or mountainous terrain, of course, you're not going to be able to use that because it's kind of meaningless because you're not going to be the same surface. This is kind of just a pictorial of that. So you can see here as the altimeter setting changes that if you didn't change your altimeter setting, your altitude is going to actually vary the same way that altimeter. So a lower altimeter setting is going to put you at a lower altitude if you don't set it to the correct setting. And then just showing here that QFE refers to surface level, or if you have a radar altimeter, it's going to give you the height. Again, QNE is based on a 2992 datum. QNH is based on mean sea level. QFE is saying, hey, I want to show my level is 0 at the runway elevation. So what can go wrong with the altimeter? If you're when you're looking at your altimeter, what can be a problem? Well, the important thing to start with is the altimeter is really just a barometer. It's really just measuring differences in air pressure. And air pressure varies with altitude, but it also varies with temperature and the air masses. So basically weather or moving to different parts of the atmosphere. And air mass pressure differences are kind of by local setting, the local correct altimeter setting into the altimeter. So if you don't have a correct local altimeter setting in the altimeter, it's not going to read right. So your indicated altitude is not going to be what your true altitude is. And probably just as importantly, or sometimes more importantly, is temperature differences are not accounted for at all in the altimeter. So in this picture here, you can see your true altitude and your indicated altitude. At this point here, if you didn't change your altimeter setting, you flew over to here, you're actually going to be at a lower altitude than what your, you're going to be at a higher altitude than what your altimeter setting is, because the actual pressure is increasing over that space. So here where it's 1014 at that same actual altitude is going to be closer to 1016. So as the altimeter setting, the pressure of the air goes up, if you're flying at what's indicated at the same altitude, your actual altitude is going to go up. And conversely, if these were tilted, more importantly, if they're tilted the other way, so you're going to an area of lower pressure, if you're flying the same indicated altitude, your true altitude is going to be less. So that's a gotcha if you don't set the altimeter. So if you're going on a long cross country in a glider and you don't reset your altimeter to the local setting, your actual altitude is going to be off. And with temperatures, which we can't adjust, there's nothing we can set in the altimeter. If we go from warmer to colder temperatures for the same indicated altitude, our true altitude is going to go down. And there's a saying, high to low, look out below. And that refers to if you're going from high pressure to low pressure, your altimeter setting, if you're going from high temperature to low temperature, high to low, and either of those, look out below because you're going to be lower than what your actual altitude is going to be lower than what your indicated altitude is. If you don't have the right altimeter setting in, besides just being a danger of the ground, you also are going to be off on what you're calling in the traffic pattern and what ATC may expect if you're actually talking ATC. And as I talked about earlier, it actually affects your aircraft performance, mostly with your tow planes, your motor gliders, but also landing at a high altitude. This chart here is just it's more of a, if you were flying in extremely cold temperatures, the effects that the temperature will have as far as an error. And they're saying height above the airport here. So for instance, if you thought you were 500 feet above the airport and we were in an extremely cold day at negative 20 degrees outside, you're actually going to be 70 feet low. And it's even more extreme at higher altitude. So if you thought you were 5,000 feet above the airport and it was negative 20 degrees, you would actually be 710 feet lower than that. Okay. An instrument that is unique to gliders is the variometer. A variometer measures ascent and descent of a glider and the air mass combined. So it basically is telling how fast are you going up, how fast are you going down relative to the Earth. It's very similar to a vertical speed indicator, but much more responsive and sensitive to changes in altitude. And it's displayed as speed as opposed to a vertical speed indicator, which is going to be displayed in feet per minute. And that speed is going to either be in knots or meters per second. The principle of operation of variometers is very similar to altimeter, except for it's going to measure the rate of change of the static pressure as opposed to just the absolute value of the static pressure. So how quickly that static pressure that you're moving through is changing versus just what that actual static pressure is. There's two main types, mechanical and electric. Mechanical uses a flask, which is basically a little storage of ambient air. And on the other side of that, there's going to be a diaphragm, and there's going to be a small hole between the flask and the diaphragm. And the other side is going to be connected to static pressure. So air flows into or out of that flask, depending upon pressure differences inside the flask versus outside ambient air pressure. And a higher flow rate through that onto that diaphragm is going to equate to higher rates of climb or descent. The electrical version of the variometer also has a flask, but it measures changes in resistance. So it's going to possibly have a diaphragm, or it could have just a thermistic metal type of thing, and it's going to basically change the resistance across it. So it's going to use an electrical versus actually mechanical linkage. And a picture of that here is we have the air flask or insulated air reservoir, and that goes through a capillary system, and they call this older pressure. So that's the pressure of the air that you were in, and then the static vent goes into the other side, and the air is going to flow through this capillary, and that rate that flows through is going to dictate how fast or how much this diaphragm moves left or right. And there's going to be a sensor attached to that. So here we can see if we're gaining height, air is going to flow out of the capacity bottle because the pressure is higher in there and we're going into low pressure air. If we're losing height, air is going to flow into that capacity or bottle or flask. Electrical, again, like I said, it just has some thermistors here that are doing the same thing, but you still have that flask and you still have static pressure on the other side. Some enhancements to an audio system. But one other thing I wanted to say about the speeds in knots and meters per second. It can help, especially if you're a powered aircraft pilot, to know that 1 knot is equivalent to about 100 feet per minute, and 1 meter per second is equivalent to about 200 feet per minute. So some enhancements to the basic variometer, which is just measuring how fast is the glider moving relative up and down relative to the ground, is an audio, which uses tones or beeps at various rates and pitches to indicate climb or descent rate. You're only going to find this with electric variometers. The biggest thing about this is it's a huge safety enhancement because you're able to look out of the cockpit as opposed to looking at a needle inside your cockpit. So you can be focusing on traffic in the air and the ground. It's also, at least to me, easier to gauge conceptualize changes in lift and sink. Here in that tone change is a immediate feedback on whether you're in stronger lift or sink. Another variometer enhancement is the McCready ring. And this is a device that displays the optimal speed to fly based on what your expected thermal strength is. So as we're flying from thermal to thermal, we might have an idea of how strong the thermals are that day, and we can set our McCready ring based on that expected thermal strength, and it'll tell you how fast to fly based on whatever sink you happen to be in between thermals, using a formula that this guy, Dr. McCready, developed back in the 1950s, and the glider polar. So basically the performance of the wing on your glider. So the faster you fly, obviously the faster you sink. And this McCready formula takes that into account, and you'll fly a faster speed the more sink you're in. And the higher strength of a thermal you expect, you're also going to fly a faster speed. You also have an averager variometer, and that's going to tell you what your climb rate was for a specified period. Could be as little as one rotation around. And that helps determine whether a thermal is really adequate to stay in your actual versus perceived performance, because when you're in a thermal, you're not going to have the same exact smooth rate of climb throughout. So an averager will help you determine how fast am I really climbing over a period of time. And then thermal assist is a neat electronic aid that uses GPS position and actually where you're actually encountering in a thermal the highest rate of climb. And it helps you center on a thermal, which is basically getting to where the strongest core of the thermal is. So basic uncompensated variometer has an inherent flaw in that it doesn't take into account that if I'm flying fast and I pull back on the stick and I pop up in altitude, that climb isn't due to thermal. It's not due to or ridge lift or any kind of lift in the air. We call that a stick thermal. So pulling back on the stick causes the glider to climb, but at a cost of less speed. So are you really gaining anything? Well, probably not. You're just artificially gaining altitude, and your variometer is going to tell you that you're going up if you have a uncompensated. What you really want to know is, am I going up because I'm in rising air? The total energy variometer compensates for this, and there's two types. There's a Venturi tube type, which is basically uses a tube on the aircraft with holes on the back, and it uses a very Venturi effect to offset some of that artificial thermal from pulling back on the stick. And then there's another type that actually just uses on a pitot tube inlet to the variometer that also does the same thing. It offsets some of that pressure change that's due to the actual airspeed change. Finally, we have the Netto variometer, which will tell you not how fast you're climbing or descending across over the Earth, but actually is telling you how fast the air that you're in is ascending or descending. And it basically just uses a mechanical system or electronic system combined with your glider polar to subtract that sink rate of your glider from your what your variometer is indicating. So it basically is just telling you how fast the air is moving up and down. Not as useful for most type of flying, because what we want to know is how the glider is actually doing over the ground and not how the air is doing. It's more of a useful tool to see whether you are doing a good job of staying in rising air after the fact and not while you're actually flying along. So here's just a diagram of what's happening, is that if you're flying about 3,000 feet, 80 knots, and you pull back, now you're at 3,120 feet, 50 knots. Well, the variometer is going to say that the uncompensated variometer is going to say that you were in lift, but the reality is you just traded that airspeed for altitude and you weren't in lift. These are just some diagrams of how they work. Your variometers, from simple to complex, basic mechanical, your McCready ring. So this ring right here rotates around, and that's going to have a speed indication on it that this needle is going to point to and tell you to fly. I want to fly this fast. Do I want to fly this fast? Do I want to fly this fast? Based on your expected thermal strength. And then we have our complex electronic, which has a variety of different indications that you can show on there, from your average variometer or your average rate of climb to your netto and your McCready settings and so forth. Okay, on to a flight computer. A flight computer basically uses variometer, GPS, and pilot inputs to aid in soaring and safety decisions through navigation and performance. There's lots of ways that you can have a flight computer on board. It can be something mounted on the panel. It could be a larger moving map type of display. So it could just be a circular device on your panel. It could be a large moving map. It could be an app that you put onto a Android device. So basically, and it could be from basic to very complex on all types of setups. Typical features you're going to find out is in a flight computer is a database. You can have land out locations, common turn points, airport information, airspace information, moving maps. Can have your predictive weather overlay, so you can kind of see where it was predicted to be the best lift or where to stay away from bad weather. It's going to give you distance, estimated time of arrival, and expected altitude to points. And it's going to give you your glide range based on current conditions and whatever you might have put in on that McCready setting. So gives you a whole lot of different information. Very useful for competition, and or if you're doing some kind of a task where you're trying to fly, say, a long triangle or an out and back. Again, at navigation aid and your speed to fly through all these different air currents are going to be updated for you, as opposed to you having to manually compute them or change a ring on your variometer. Also useful is the flight path trace. If you're trying to get back to where you knew there were good conditions or where you had a good thermal, it can be useful for that, especially if you're in some kind of a long line of lift. Again, simple to complex, tablet type of based, a commercial built type of system, and then all variety of different types of displays that can be panel mounted. Flight alarm, FLARM, it stands for flight alarm. This system is used for glider traffic location. So it's going to give you a range and a vertical separation. Its main purpose is for collision alerting. So it's going to give you a discrete location and avoidance direction. So in this case, these red dots mean that you have a close proximity of traffic and they're only 659 meters. And this indication here is saying that they're in level flight with you. So its primary purpose is to help avoid collisions with gliders. If we have multiple gliders thermaling in the same area, working the same lift, it can be a useful tool. It actually can help you keep your eyes out of the cockpit, because you know that I'm going to have this audio alert for anybody that gets close to me, and I can actually be looking outside for actual traffic. The other thing they can do, and the more advanced they are, the more they can do this, is actually kind of snooping on performance. So this display here shows this, and it'll show you how far you are from another glider and what their rate of climb is, and also their altitude relative to yours. And it'll color display those also. So you can kind of look at how everybody that's, displayed on the scope is doing with that. Some limitations of a FLARM device is it's really only good up to several kilometers away. It's only good with other FLARM equipped aircraft. And it's using, GPS and algorithms to determine collision. So if those aren't quite right, it's not going to give you an accurate depiction. Newer systems in our Boulder aircraft, club aircraft have these, where it's integrated with ADS-B and transponder, and it's going to give you better range and more situational awareness. Now, it's not going to give you the snooping type of thing, but it will show you other targets out there, including aircraft, powered aircraft that don't have FLARM systems. All right, magnetic compass, gyroscopic instruments, G-meter, outside air temperature, your compass, most of us probably know how a compass works, but it uses Earth's magnetism to determine direction. There are some errors associated with it that you probably want to be aware of, especially for your check ride, and you can read up on those. It's really, the compass is useful in a big picture type of sense to help you roughly determine your direction, but it's not going to be an instrument that you're going to be using minute by minute flying. Gyroscopic instruments really not used in gliders. If we're cloud flying, you'd want to have it. And again, your motor touring gliders, which are more set up like aircraft, powered aircraft, are going to have that. G-meter, some gliders are going to have that, especially if you're going to plan on doing extensive aerobatics. You want to consult your glider flight manual, pilot operating handbook for whether it's required for certain aerobatics that you might want to do. Outside air temperature, your computer is going to use that information, but it's also good to know freezing level if you're carrying water ballast, and also useful if you were going to really be flying at high altitudes, typically in wave flight, because you generally don't want to take fiberglass type aircraft into situations where you have a super low air temperature. And finally, the yaw string. It's the original instrument, if you will, for flying an aircraft well, and it's also the cheapest. Basically, your yaw string is going to help you maintain coordinated flight, which is how you're going to extract the most performance from the glider. So, if you're in slipping flight, so your nose is pointed outside the turn, the yaw string is going to point to the outside. If you're in skidding flight where your nose is the inside, it's going to point to the left side in this case, to the inside of the turn, and coordinated, it's going to point straight back. And here's a picture of a yaw string. And it's in coordinated flight. It's why it's level, straight and level flight, but he's flying straight. All right, any questions?
Jeff, that was great. That was a great rundown of instrumentation and glider. Thank you very much. Only one comment I have is when you talked about the advantages of having the audio in a Vario. One thing I'd like to add, and this is more of a flight instruction than it is a ground instruction, and that is you're able to keep, when you're able to keep your eyes outside of the cockpit, it means you can look at the horizon and just listen to that thing going beep, 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 and hopefully it's going to beep, 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 beep. It's really getting, excited. That means you're in good lift, and you're able to look at the horizon, and you're able to make a much better turn when you look at the horizon than if you're staring at or chasing needles either on airspeed or on the variometer. So it lets you keep your eyes outside of the cockpit, and that's important for better maneuvering of the aircraft.
Right, and safety,
and safety. Yeah, both.
Being able to look for other aircraft.
Yep. Does anybody else have any questions? Jeff, that was an excellent overview. Casey, you're next. You have 2 sections, and you may not be able to get them both done here in a reasonable amount of time. So we may have to make this this ground school 4 sessions rather than 3, and that's my fault. I'm being a little bit too aggressive on this. So Casey, if you're ready to talk about the aerodynamics of flight or glider performance, whatever you think is most, and then we can, if you're able to get them both done, great tonight. If not, we can take one section and make it the and turn it into the next chapter of this ground school.
You bet. All right. Everybody see my screen okay?
Yep, it's coming through.
Great. All right. Hey, Jeff, thanks for that overview. Obviously, instrumentation and all the tools that we use is very important on the inside, how we operate as a pilot. And then, of course, we want to understand the aerodynamics of flight too. This is a huge topic. Do my best to compress that as much as possible. But please do read through these chapters yourself. So let's start very simply and talking about the 4 forces of flight. If you're a powered aircraft pilot, you'll be very familiar with this graphic mostly, which we call our lift, weight, thrust, and drag. There's something interesting in a glider, though. We see our lift vector. And essentially, a glider, because it doesn't have an engine, creates thrust by converting potential energy that's been accumulated into kinetic energy as it glides downward, trading height for distance. And in fact, even though we might go many, many miles and be able to climb and go long distances, that whole time the aircraft is descending through an air mass. So our objective as a glider pilot is just to make sure that we stay in rising air so that we can continue to create that thrust. The lift vector is effectively split into 2 components. One of those parts is opposing the weight force or the gravity, and the other is component of the lift vector opposes drag. So very familiar piece here, but it's important to be able to describe how thrust is produced and how lift is produced in an aircraft that doesn't make its own thrust. One of the obviously big pieces and something we're always fighting is drag. When we talk about drag, we really talk about total drag. And there's 2 types of drag that make up total drag, and that's going to be our parasite drag and our induced drag. Parasitic drag we can think of as like a leech, right? It's just grabbing onto this aircraft and slowing us down. And it takes the form of 3 different types of drag. Form drag, that results from the turbulent weight caused by separation of airflow from the surface of a structure. And we've all felt form drag if you stick your hand out of a moving car sideways at highway speeds, and you can feel that incredible dynamic pressure on the front, and then the burble on the backside of your hand is really us feeling the result of that form drag. If you turn your hand sideways, it goes a little bit faster, but then you have a skin friction drag. And those are the frictional forces that create a boundary layer that's equal and opposite the skin friction force on the glider. And then, of course, interference drag happens anytime we have 2 structures of varied air currents that meet. That's particularly relevant anytime you have wings meeting a fuselage or a vertical stabilizer meeting a horizontal stabilizer. Those local air effects have to combine and kind of crash into each other and create interference drag. Another type of drag that makes up total drag is induced drag. And we think of induced drag as the drag is that's created when we create lift. And so as we get high pressure on the lower side of the wing, low pressure on the high side, and then of course we end up creating a vortice that fills in the lower pressure on the top side. That lift is lost, but the energy to produce is different, has already been expanded. So I would say the 2 types of drag are parasitic and induced drag, and then how each of those drags are formed. When we look at that, what we see is that parasite drag is very low at low air speeds and increases rapidly with an increase of airspeed, as we see on the left-hand side. And induced drag is high when we're at high angles of attack, and then as we reduce our angle of attack and gain speed, that reduces over that speed range, and it creates what we think of as a very familiar drag profile. And if we took the sum of those two types of drag, we see our minimum drag, or our LD max, over there, kind of in the bottom at the bottom, and that's our total drag, and that's how we determine our LD max. And looking at the right side, we see something very familiar too, and this is what we call a glide polar. We're going to look at that more in the performance section, but basically, if you took that total drag and flipped it upside down, you're going to end up with something that looks very, very similar to a polar, which we use a lot in gliding. And we'll go through the details of how to use a polar in the next section. But I think that's a really cool demonstration of how that minimum drag also relates to our best glide speeds. One of the big factors that affects drag and controllability is the shape of our wing. And we call this wing plan form. And you can think of that as the silhouette that you look at from the top of the wing. There's 4 regular wing plan forms: elliptical, rectangular, tapered, and maybe even swept forward. An elliptical wing is a beautiful wing, fully rounded. It's relatively difficult to make because of all the compound curves and all the different changing structures on there. It's a very efficient wing because as the wing tapers out gracefully to the tip, the lift profile decreases, and it's almost like making a natural winglet out there. Really helps with the induced drag. One of the problems, though, is because the lift is so equal across an elliptical wing, the stall characteristics of an elliptical wing can be very, very sudden and very prompt. So something to keep an eye out for if you fly an aircraft with an elliptical wing. A very simple wing to build is a rectangular wing. That's a very easy wing to build. Looks like a big Hershey bar. You see that on a lot of Pipers and things like that. It actually has relatively high induced drag because we end up with a very big wingtip vortice on the tip there, but very gentle stall characteristics. Typically, we can typically design those wings so that they stall at the root and the stall progresses outward, so we maintain aileron effectivity. Most sailplanes that you'll see and that you'll fly actually have a tapered wing, which is much closer to an elliptical wing, but takes advantage of some of the ease of construction techniques of a rectangular wing while giving some of the benefits of an elliptical wing. A swept forward wing, a little more rare, but a great looking sight when you see it fly overhead. The tailless design that Jeff was talking about, I believe actually uses a swept forward wing on that one as well. Really good stall characteristics with that one because that can be designed so that the ailerons are still effective even when the wing root is stalled. Anytime we're worried about stall and stall characteristics, there's a trick that can be applied to a wing design, and that's to put a little bit of twist in it. So we can have a twist that causes the wing root to have a higher AOA than the tip, and so that way the root stalls before the tip, so we have good aileron effectivity throughout. However, twist also comes at the detriment of aircraft performance. So some higher performance aircraft have little or no twist. When we look back to that glide polar, we really want to think about glide ratio. And that's a really exciting thing to think about as you move from training aircraft into higher performance aircraft. You start salivating about these incredible glide ratios that they get. And glide ratio is very simply just the airspeed that we get divided by the sink rate in relation to 1. So it's the number of feet that a glider travels horizontally in air for every foot of altitude loss. And we can see that on the glide polar. To kind of give you a reference, the Club ASK 21 in regular terms typically gets about a 20 to 25 to 1, where a lot of the high performance ships that the private gliders are flying out on the west side of the field are 50 or 60 to 1. So incredible performance increase through flatter polars and much more high performance aircraft. So a glide polar is a graph provided by the aircraft manufacturers that's available in the flight manual, and it details the glider's sink and still air at airspeed ranges that are within the normal speed envelope. On the left-hand graphic there, you're going to see minimum flying speed. That's essentially where the aircraft will stall. You'll see that the sink rate is relatively high at the stall because we're essentially we're on the backside of the polar, or in aircraft terms, what you would consider the backside of the power curve. The aircraft is still flying. It's not technically stalled, but the drag is very, very high. And so the sink rate gets very high. Another speed that we'll go through in the performance is our best lift over drag, or our best LD. This is the speed that we should fly the glider at to get from point A to point B with minimum height loss. And there's a lot of ifs and caveats with that, so we'll kind of touch on some of those. But generally speaking, that's gonna preserve as much altitude as we fly from point A to point B. One of the factors that affects aircraft performance is the aspect ratio. So the aspect ratio is basically how long and how skinny is our wing. So aspect ratio is determined by dividing the wingspan from wingtip to wingtip by the average chord. Again, the chord is the distance from the leading edge to the trailing edge of the wing. Aspect ratio plays a significant difference in the reduction of induced drag, especially over the span. So typically we get much better glide ratios by increasing aspect ratio. However, there's some downsides to having really high aspect ratio. As you can imagine, these really long wings, there's a lot of distance between those tips. That lower one, 86 feet, that's a huge wingspan there. But adverse yaw with ailerons can become a major factor there. And they can be tricky to fly because they can require a lot of rudder coordination in order to make them fly appropriately. Anytime we're talking about aerodynamics, we want to consider stability. And there's really two types of stability that you might be asked about on your oral exam. The first of those is static stability. Static stability is the initial tendency of an object to return to a state of equilibrium. So if you were to take like one of those old punching bags that we all probably had when we were kids, and you knock it over, very low center of gravity, and it has high static stability. So the initial tendency is for it to return to an upright position. Whereas if I took this pin and I drop it, it doesn't have positive static stability. It does not tend to turn initially to a state of equilibrium. Dynamic stability, on the other hand, describes the oscillations or the return as a response to static stability. So if we were to have an aircraft that was neutral dynamic stability and we displaced the flight controls and just let it go through oscillations, you might see that that fugoid, or that rate of change, just continues. Hopefully we have an aircraft with positive dynamic stability, and those changes get smaller over time due to interactions between the trim system and the horizontal stabilizer and the main wing, also related to CG and center of lift. But hopefully those dynamics will get smaller and smaller and smaller. And negative dynamic stability would be very bad. That would be an aircraft that would be very, very difficult to fly because any out of trim or oscillation that started would tend to destabilize over time. Anytime we're talking about an aircraft, we want to remember our axes of rotation. We have the longitudinal axis. I always think about it's a long way on the Airbus from the nose to the tail. It's kind of our longest piece. And that runs from the nose to the tail, and we roll about the longitudinal axis. The lateral axis moves from wingtip to wingtip, and we pitch about the lateral axis. And then the vertical axis goes through the center of gravity. In fact, all of these go through the center of gravity in order to give us yaw around the vertical axis. It's important to understand that the description of the axes, we can talk about that as far as motion about an axis. But when we're talking about stability, we're really talking about the stability of that long line. And that can be a little bit confusing. So if I was talking about longitudinal stability, what I'm really referencing is that long line that goes from the nose to the tail. And I want to talk about the stability, hopefully positive dynamic stability of that axis as it moves up and down. Lateral stability, on the other hand, would describe a tendency to return to a wings level flight. I think that's an important point, and one that you want to kind of keep in mind and be able to talk about if we're talking about rotation about an axis versus the stability of an axis. There's a lot of factors affecting stability, particularly CG, flap setting, tail ballast, especially as you get into a higher performance aircraft, and dihedral. One of the things that creates a positive static stability and dynamic stability is the placement of the center of gravity in relation to the center of lift. Typically, gliders are designed to be slightly nose heavy in order to improve that longitudinal stability. The tail is typically put on the horizontal stab in a negative AOA, which is very exaggerated in this illustration. But that provides the pitching force necessary to return it to normal flight after an upset. That was a great conversation we had about flutter. And again, just like to reiterate that flutter is based on true airspeed. And when I was going through my commercial rating with Armand, I asked him that same question, and I was always bothered by everyone's reaction to the exact dynamics of this. So here's the answer that I have about why flutter is based on true airspeed. And I found this in an Australian flying club flutter explained link that you can look up there. But basically, this author described that in thin air with a high density altitude, that permits flutter to happen more easily because it has a reduced damping effect at those high density altitudes. There's less air molecules to stop an oscillation. And when you pair that with a sailplane's high structural elasticity, the ability for the wings to move, you can quickly get to an airspeed where flutter may continue if you exceeded V&E. That's my answer, Armand. I'm sticking to it.
Okay, that answer has me more in question than ever before. I don't doubt what you said. I'm just trying to process it. It's a difficult concept to come up with.
Yeah.
Why it is that they flutter. But one thing I've never been in an aircraft that has fluttered, and I'd like to keep it that way.
Absolutely.
So regardless of the physics, as a glider pilot, I'd like to not really find out. I don't want to have people say, "How did you know that was going to flutter if you went that fast?" So we want to be careful of that. And the main thing, jumping back to the oral exams coming up for our students is, flutter is based on true airspeed. And we want to make sure we not letting our true airspeed get above the published maximums. Sorry, Casey.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. Flutter, when we talk about flutter let's talk about turning flight. So the greatest thing about turning or about sailplanes is you're going to spend a lot of time turning. Just out of fun, I kind of picked out one of my last flights. I was down by Winter Park and digging out a thermal over by James Peak. And at this point, you're really low. I was relatively low, and I really needed that thermal. So I was really paying attention to the mechanics of turning flight to make sure I was efficient and able to get out of there. Keep in mind that if we're flying in a straight line, a glider must overcome its inertia or its tendency to continue in a straight line. And so the pilot creates the necessary force by using first the ailerons to bank the glider. And then, of course, we'll coordinate that with rudder so that the direction of total lift is inclined. And then in that turn, we're going to have to increase our pitch attitude or angle of attack by increasing load factor to fly level. A lot of mechanics going on there, but important to understand that we want that to be kind of a horizontal component of lift in order to effective turn. And of course, keep it coordinated throughout so that we're not increasing parasitic drag by increasing the surface area of our fuselage exposed to the free airflow. Load factor, again, is the ratio of total air load acting on the glider in relation to the gross weight of the glider. And there's actually some great charts in the in the Glider Flying Handbook that can illustrate this. But in a turn at a constant speed, the angle of attack, again, has to be increased to furnish the extra lift necessary to overcome the centrifugal force and the inertia opposing that turn that was keeping us straight. So as we increase the bank angle, the AOA must increase to provide the lift. And the result of increasing the AOA too much is we could reach our critical AOA. Remember that an aircraft can stall at any speed. And it's all really related to the angle of attack and reaching that critical angle of attack. Remember from our textbooks, and we could see in that top graphic that when you're in a 60-degree bank, level turn, you're going to be at a 2G turn. And if we were to do that same 60-degree angle of a bank, that's going to increase our stall speed by 40%. So pretty drastic increase in stall speed. Again, it's really based on AOA, but we see that in the cockpit as an airspeed indication. So that's something that you could predict. Next slide. Cool. One of the things to consider as well is the rate of turn and the radius of turn that we are affecting in a turn. So if the airspeed increases and the angle of anchor remains the same, then our rate of turn will decrease. So we can get a decreasing rate of turn that way. However, if the radius of a turn at a bank angle, it varies directly with the square of the airspeed. And so basically that means if the airspeed is doubled, the radius of the turn will be 4 times greater. When we're trying to thermal, that's a really important point to keep in mind, because it can significantly kick us out of a thermal if we thermal at too high of an airspeed. So in this graphic, you get to see that a level stall airspeed at a gross weight, standard gross weight, is going to be 38 knots. That's going to increase to 41 knots at a 30-degree bank, 45 knots at a 45-degree bank, and 53 knots in a 60-degree bank. And we see there that if we speed up to as much as 80 miles an hour in a 30-degree bank without increasing that bank angle, our turn radius is 740 feet, which is probably larger than most of the thermals that we're going to find out there. So proper turn rate and bank angle are important when thermaling and when turning. Transitioning from power to gliders, and Jeff had a great graphic there that described the yaw string, and I found this video. I'm going to play this real quick. If you see down here at the bottom, there's a great big inclinometer or a ball taped to the front there, and they've turned the engine off to get rid of the slipstream effect. I'd like you to see the coordination of the yaw string and the inclinometer. And this is a little tough for power transitioning pilots to kind of wrap their head around. We're trained in power flying that to return to coordinated flight, you would step on the ball. But in this case, you can see that the yaw string is essentially opposite. They're indicating the same thing, but it's a great visualization here. One of the things that I learned kind of early on was to return to coordinated flight was to step on the head of the snake. And so if we look at that one more time, the snake would be the string there, whatever works for you there. But if you found a snake in the field, you want to step on the head so you don't get bit. So as that moves off to the side to return to coordinated flight, we would add a right rudder. And in this case, to return, you would step on the head and go back to the left side. So I hope that illustration is helpful for you, especially if you've already learned to fly conventional aircraft. Jeff used the same graphic, and I think it's a good one. We can see the difference between a slipping and a skidding aircraft. But in this case, we can also see what the yaw string would look like. And as Jeff said, that's going to show the free airflow over the top of the canopy. And again, if we follow that simple rule of step on the head of the snake, that will help keep us in coordinated flight and improve the quality of the turns that we have. We can fly uncoordinated sometimes, and sometimes we, in fact, choose to fly uncoordinated. And when we do this for a long time, especially in a descent with one wing lowered, we call this a slip. And there's really 2 types of slip. Typically, we'll do a forward slip. You might use a forward slip if your air brakes or your speed brakes were inoperative, or if you just needed to adjust your flight path a little bit. This is effective because by flying uncoordinated, you can see that we expose more of the wetted area of the fuselage to the free air, thereby increasing parasitic drag and then increasing our descent rate. So in a forward slip, the direction of the motion is the same as before the slip was begun, and we're flying in a straight line. A side slip is distinguished from a forward slip because in this case, the glider's longitudinal axis remains parallel to the original flight path, but we're actually in an arcing or changing flight path. A lot of times we might transition from a forward slip to a side slip, especially close to the ground, and a side slip would be used to counteract wind drift during a crosswind landing. Cool. Finally, ground effect. Ground effect, you'll find in the book there, is an effect whereby there's a reduction in induced drag for the same amount of lift produced. Typically, when we're within about one wingspan above the ground, the decrease in induced drag allows the glider to fly at a lower airspeed. You could also think of that as a decrease in downwash and a reduction in wingtip vortices when we're within one glider width of the ground. This results in a lower AOA required to produce the same amount of lift. One thing that I'll use caution about flying in ground effect, you need to be very mindful about using the air brakes. Typically, when we go into ground effect run like this, we call it, your air brakes or your speed brakes would be stowed so that we're as efficient as possible. And you can see this pilot is really stretching his glide by becoming super, super efficient. However, at some point, you might need to land or pick your spot. And when you deploy your air brakes, there's typically a pitch change associated with that. And being this close to the ground, it can lead to a very hard bounce or a balloon, both of which could be dangerous in this situation. So be mindful of that. Also, if you're out in Boulder, please be very careful at the end of the day to look both ways before crossing the active glider runway. A lot of times the private gliders end up flying all day. They don't come home until 5 or 6 or 7 o'clock at night in the summertime. And they'll typically land to the west because that's where they park. And a lot of times we get a normal diurnal flow in the evening of a west wind that starts producing in Boulder. So while people have been landing east all day long, the gliders may return to the west. And a glider returning from the west can be very, very difficult to see. So be very cautious with that. You'll kind of practice that ground effect return during a rope break. A lot of times you might be low, you'll be very, very efficient, and you might end up doing a slight tailwind landing in Boulder back to your parking spot. And a lot of times you'll end up in this ground effect for some time. All right. And that is a very quick aerodynamic review. Try to speed it up a little bit, Armand. Any questions on aerodynamics?
Anybody have anything they want to discuss? We're not, we have another section here on glider performance, but we're over 2 hours and learning goes down if we take too long. So Casey will continue glider performance on the next session to be scheduled. It may well be next Wednesday. I might try to keep these every Wednesday to keep it Danny, you have your hand up. I think you've had your hand up for some time. Do you remember the question by any chance? After all this time?
Yeah, I remember. I was good when we were talking about the reduction in VNE at higher altitudes. It's not really important, but I was just going to say I've seen that. I've done it. It reminds me a lot of flying a jet, where when you transition from your true airspeed you'll transition to a Mach meter, and your VNE is coming down, and you even get up, if you want to get in real technical, you get up to what they call a coffin corner. And what I think is going on in the gliders is just aerodynamic effects. You've got straight wings, and there's certain airspeeds where things start happening, bad things start happening. So the only thing I'll add at this point after this long session is just urge everybody, all the students, to honor those speeds.
Yeah, Danny, you mentioned a term called coffin corner. And I think a lot of our students might not know what that term means. Jeff, who flew a lot of F-16, he probably knows what coffin corner means. Jeff, you want to tell us what coffin corner is?
So the coffin corner that I remember is where your stall speed and your max speed start coming much, much closer together. I had a buddy who flew the U-2, and they basically are always right on the edge of that. And the F-16, anytime I was up close to 50,000 feet, I was also probably almost supersonic. I'm trying to remember what my calibrated airspeed was. I might be at 200 something knots and be at 0.9 something Mach. But an F-16, because of the flight control computer really doesn't let you stall. So I would say that I know aerodynamically at high altitudes, it seemed like you were more concerned with true airspeed than calibrated airspeed. I don't know how to put it other than that. So it could be similar in a glider.
Yeah.
Well, the thing with,
I was just going to add there, like I ferried a pipistrel motor glider back in the spring from Florida up to Michigan, and it had a table in it. Of course, it didn't have any kind of movable VNE, but it had a table in there. As you got higher up in the altitudes, you had to start subtracting. So you had to do a little math, but it was placarded right there on the airspeed indicator, because it was like a 1,000-mile trip, doing it. I did it overnight, 12 hours of flying, and I was getting up there around 80, 65. Well, at one point I was 11,000 feet, topping some stuff. And, but yeah, so I was watching that thing there. I've been actually shopping for a motor glider, and I was looking at the Lambada, which actually had one of their airframes break up because of a flutter. And the company subsequently went out of business. They had a ballistic parachute on it, so no one was hurt. But, bad things can happen. Just honor the speeds.
yeah, so what I was trying to get at here, and when we turn that coffin corner term is you're up, it's probably going to happen at a high altitude where your true airspeed and your flutter speed is based on true airspeed. And this is something that I want everybody to understand, because it probably will be on your it will be a question on the oral of your check ride. And that is your true airspeed determines flutter, but your indicated airspeed can determine stall. So you could get in at a high altitude, you could get into a situation where these two are coming together in what's called the coffin corner. So your true airspeed is getting you close to flutter, but your indicated airspeed is getting you close to stall. And obviously that's a situation you don't want to get into. So anyway.
I'll bet the Paralon, is it Paralon or Paralon glider that's flying up in the stratosphere?
Paralon.
Paralon.
Paralon
I think that they probably are very much concerned with that all the time.
Sure.
The difference with the term coffin corner, it's applies to jets, and the problem is that when you get up there, your stall speed's very high. You got a very fine line between stalling and how fast you can go without exceeding, going supersonic is their problem. And if they go supersonic, then you can get back Mach tuck, and basically you end up losing control of the airplane. And so that's why, the nice name, it's actually technically called a Q corner or something in the chart. But I don't think that's derived directly to what we're talking about in gliders. But there's obviously a speed where things start fluttering, and fiberglass airplanes don't do well with flutter.
Yeah. So at any rate, everybody, let's kind of wrap this up, because I think we've done enough time that everybody's going to start to lose their ability to learn. But we talked about gliders and sailplanes. We talked about the components and the systems, and those are things that you need. And we went through the aerodynamics of flight with Casey. So next week, and flight instruments with Jeff, sorry. So next week, we're going to have glider performance. Casey will give his presentation on glider performance. And then we're going to get into some other topics, such as pre-flight and ground operations, launch and recovery, towing, which we have to learn in the United States, and some other things. So this will probably become these guys are doing a great job of covering all this material. And so we'll probably turn this into 4 sections. Maybe it'll grow into 5. I don't know. Whatever it takes, so that SSB has a really good documentation on the ground school of the Glider Flying Handbook. We're going to make that'll become available to everybody. Jeff and Casey are going to do the hard work. I'm going to act like I'm the big shot here who monitors it. But do keep in mind, Jeff and Casey are very experienced pilots. They are much more, I'm sure they have a lot more hours than I have. I maybe have more in glider, but these guys are great aviators. They're career aviators. They really know their stuff. And I think we saw that this evening. So I invite you all and your friends and more people to be back in about a week. And we'll have more sections of the Glider Flying Handbook covered by Jeff and Casey. And I think you guys can all learn a lot from them. I think you can learn more from them than you can from me. And I look forward to Jeff and Casey becoming CFI-Gs. Jeff just needs to add a G to his glider, to his helicopter. CFI Casey, he basically does instruction at his airline, but we need to get him an initial CFI with a G on it. And so with that, does anybody have any questions, comments, concerns, whatever?
Two things.
Yeah,
Armand, will you send out another email?
absolutely. Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
For each one of them. Okay.
Yeah, expect those emails to come out on Sundays. I've kind of gotten the habit of sending out the ground school emails on Sunday. I think that's when folks kind of settle down for next week and kind of think about when to do it. We may move it to Tuesday. We may keep it at Wednesday. I don't know yet. But this will be on the SSB YouTube channel. So you can watch it whenever you want. And, there was a lot of material covered here. So I think having the recording will be a plus. And so you can go back and you can say, he went pretty fast through that section. There's a lot of good stuff in it, and you can go and review it and watch those parts. So,
Right.
Tell your friends that this material is here. We've got really good CFI candidates to review the material, and look forward to seeing you all out of the field.
Great. Thank you very much, all of you.
So if there's nothing else, I'll say good night to everybody, and we'll see y'all in a week or so.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Yeah,
Thank you
thanks.
so much. Have a good night.
Bye.
Thanks, Casey and Jeff.
Night, and thank you.